You know, it's a good time to be a Warhammer fan. Necromunda, Hired Gun, did alright for itself in 2021, followed by Darktide in 2022, and Boltgun in 2023. And now the long-awaited sequel to 2011 Space Marine is coming out this fall. And let's also not forget that resident nerd god Henry Cavill is working with Amazon to deliver a whole new cinematic universe very soon. Pretty cool, right?
Yes, some people of culture in the audience.
Now, I'll admit, my admiration of Warhammer and 40K especially has come from a distance. I like the pageantry of the sci-fi fantasy of it all, and I've seen tons of cool miniatures that my brother has painted. It's neat stuff, but I've never really done anything with the franchise. That is, until Auroch Digital's first-person shooter Boltgun came to Game Pass recently and gave me my first real opportunity to taste and see whether the Warhammer was good. And since it recently got its Forges of Corruption DLC, and I figured what better time than now to break out my script I've been sitting on and let you all know what I thought of my maiden voyage into the franchise's waters. So let's get our chain swords stuck into some unclean ones for the glory of the Emperor. Now, despite the rich lore of the Warhammer franchise and nerd hero Rahul Kohli of Mike Flanagan fame voicing our playable hero, there's surprisingly little narrative meat to chew on here. The plot is essentially 3 or 4 brief cutscenes of someone shouting in your ear to kill lots of things or stop something from blowing up, and the game is basically just you dutifully acquiescing to these requests. This choice was probably made to accommodate new fans to the Warhammer franchise, as much as it was a nod to the rather plot-agnostic 90s shooters that, usually just had a screen or two throughout to contextualize what you were going to do. But this also foretells, for better or worse, what Boltgun is here to do. Shoot till they're all dead, and keep doing that until the game says it's run out of guys for you to shoot, and we'll get into how and why that may not be enough to hold some people's attention over the long haul. That said, there are some fun stylistic details here. The enemy character models are actually scanned in photos of the Warhammer miniatures themselves, which is such an authentic touch. There's also an idle animation where your guy will pull out a book of scriptures and start reading, humming bemusedly to himself, and you can shout battle cries at the push of a button.
I am cleansed in the blood of my enemies.
You carry around a big old saw blade and can whip it out to lawnmower man your way through hordes, and while it's actually too slow, inaccurate, and has a weird need to be aimed specifically to work, it's still cool that it's here. My favorite little piece of Warhammerishness is the little flying servo skull that accompanies you. It's the extent of the game's narrative oversight, as it notifies you that a purge is coming, meaning kill everything in sight before you can move on, or it'll wryly comment that this looks like a boss fight coming up and other tongue-in-cheek references. Its little quips are well-paced, and aside from it being fairly inconsistent with how good its direction is on where to go, it's a pleasing bit of humor in an otherwise very roar kind of game. But yeah, that's the presentation. So let's get into how the game is set up and how it plays. Now, while the character and weapon models are authentic, and while the game looks good with its laser beams going to the sky, or the more gothic levels with statues and castles, there's a lot of ad nauseum industrial stuff going on that just sort of blends together after a while. Boltgun's level design is a bit here and there too. Sometimes it's really circuitous and confusing as to where to go, and other times it definitely leads you to where you need to go by changing the lighting to the color of the key you're on the hunt for, giving you subtle but obvious indications of where you're going and why you're going there, and what you should expect to find. There's also some rather weird portal hopping that's either really contrived as to where to go, or seems to lead you on extremely well, except past your objectives and back to the start of the level. Whoops. But when Auroch Digital does throw you a bone, they do so in what has become one of gaming's most recent hot-button issues, yellow paint. You know, that stuff that I saw in games as old as 2014's Mad Max, which I recently reviewed, where things are coated in yellow to indicate their interactivity or to prevent the player from missing them or getting lost. But I'll complain about them here the same as most places because, while the intent may be wholesome on paper, the paint technique is almost never used correctly because it often points to a non-essential part of the level here in Boltgun, like showing a secret, not a path forward. And when it is showing you a way to actually progress a level, it's almost forehead-slappingly obvious that that's where you want to go anyway, with very few exceptions. The developers already proved that they could guide the player by subtly changing the lighting from generic fluorescent whites and yellows into the red, purple, or yellow key colors, so I don't know why this kind of screw it, let's just put paint on it method was adopted so inconsistently here, but there you go. These quibbles aside, let's be honest, we're all here for the booming and the shooting, and if nothing else, this game, named after a gun, does exactly that. The weapons are the real stars of the show here. The first boomer shooter I was reminded of when playing was Cultic, strangely enough, whose developer actually recently interviewed as soon as I made this, so weird coincidence. That game's crunchy, gross feedback when blowing through Badguys shows up in Boltgun in spades. I've never seen such viscera. In fact, Boltgun has a lot in common with Proteus in that every shot seems to rend blood and bone to pieces at the slightest touch. But I like how I can feel Boltgun's projectiles picking people apart, and all the context of being a holy warrior purging these vile creatures from the earth just makes it all hit that much harder. You may not be a Doomslayer, but this is as close a feeling as I've had in 2020's best game. Yeah, I said it.
You're goddamn right.
Alright, so let's talk specifics. Your standard rifle, or bolt gun, will tear the basic enemies to ribbons, and it has a built-in erratic spread to it that makes it feel realistic, but also kind of dangerous, like it's slowly becoming more and more uncontrollable. The shotgun hits like a Mack truck, and even does so at range, taking out most low-tier enemies in one glorious giblet-inducing hit. You get a very Doom-looking plasma rifle that fires single-shot blast rather than acting like a machine gun and can incinerate multiple enemies if they're close to one another. You can also pick up a laser beam cousin to this gun, as well as a melta-gun, which is essentially a railgun that sends high-damaging projectiles that just rip through people like Dead Space weapons do. You also get a rather fantastic sticky grenade launcher that'll be your best friend against many of the bosses alongside the BFG equivalent in this game called the anti-grav gun. All in all, the weapons feel really powerful because they are. Their feedback isn't just for show, as even the rifle will just eviscerate low-tier baddies. Surprisingly, you can't aim down sights in this game, and you don't really have any evasive maneuvers other than just hopping around. There's a lot of hip firing and strafing without a whole lot of movement abilities to counter your increasingly punishing enemy roster. One welcome addition to combat is grenades. Can I just say how nice it is that we finally have another shooter other than Halo that makes grenade tossing integral to gameplay? I have missed that so much. Auroch Digital gets so much credit for just making grenades like they should be. Map them to a bumper or a trigger and make them something you just throw to keep people off of you. The grenades are easy to use and highly damaging, and the Vortex grenades can just whoop some bosses. But you don't really get much other help than grenades in your ability suite, especially not in regards to movement. To put it mildly, our armored player character is not of the movement shooter clan. You have lead in your boots. Even so much that if you fall from a great height and land on an enemy, you'll crush them into giblets. It's a great touch, mind you, but one that definitely warhammers home that you are not fleet of foot. You're a tank. And as with most boomer shooters post-Doom Eternal, I expected there to be a dash move, and there kind of is, but it's more of a short gallop that's hardly quick, more of a Gears of War roadie run than anything else that acts as a charge more so than an evasive maneuver. Your capabilities can feel really underdeveloped for what's being asked of you, so it becomes this sort of attrition-based stand and deliver thing a lot, or you're just hopping around wildly, and it's hardly ideal. I guess this is as good a time as any to spotlight why combat can be such a pain in the ass, and that's the enemies. They're a varied bunch, though it does take a couple different configurations to really test you. Humanoid enemies tend to be rather dense, milling about and taking too long to see you, so you pepper their backsides with buckshot and move on. They only become truly troublesome when paired against the heavyweights, and their bullets shred your shields while you're trying to deal with the truly lethal opponents. The real nutbusters here are the plague enemies, like the Unclean One bosses and their constantly spawning Nurgles which chip away at your health, or the plague frogs which are barraging you with poisonous damage, or leaving you to step into their projectiles that they leave behind. They also take quite a beating. I truly hate these plague creatures. They are the worst. The mid-tier consists of Chaos Knights who either have bolt guns too, or who are these aspiring champion guys who rush you really fast to beat you down, and who can resurrect if you don't completely incinerate their bodies with an explosive or a power weapon. There's also these cool creature types like the agile and highly damaging flamer that often accompany the pink horrors who split into two other horrors if killed, or the screamers which are like these super agile dragons that dive bomb you for intense damage. In any given fight there's a lot going on with all these different considerations for these enemies, and especially when the sorcerer boss type shows up a couple times throughout the campaign and can often shield itself with another boss or another one of these tough enemies until you've killed them, the stakes in combat can get really high and really challenging. I'd say too high in some instances. A basic shootout will almost inevitably start with slowly walking into a new area to see where the enemies are, those enemies taking too long to notice you, and you usually plowing through the first wave before they know you were even there. But most enemies have a kind of idle and then a ready phase, so if you wade into a big crowd, they go from sitting ducks to health bar melters very quickly as they become too many to manage. It's like you've activated a bunch of turrets. And the fact that your guy gets stuck on shit in the environment a lot, especially Nurgles, makes trying to get free of this carnage collage a more harrowing task than it needed to be. You're a clunky boy, and when the game presses you to have Spider-Man-like reflexes, it can feel like you're being pushed around more than is fair or particularly fun. The last boss battle in particular just put far too many dudes in one place too often. If they're missing you at all, it's often because you're having to be extra creative in your bunny hopping, which usually means you're not able to return fire or make any meaningful progress in the fight. You're just avoiding the inevitable. But as soon as you slow down and aim more effectively, and some guns like your heavy bolt gun basically hold you in place as you fire, your enemy now has the opening they need to focus their shots and become more accurate. And there's obviously a lot more damage coming your way than you can withstand, and certainly much more than you're dealing out. So the sorcerer fights in particular just became pretty maddening. Long story short, the pieces of the game, like the enemies and the guns and the level design, are all independently pretty solid in their construction, but when put together they don't quite sing for me, especially when they're pushed to their limits. That's pretty much my impression of the main game, but the first DLC for this game, called the Forges of Corruption, actually recently just dropped. So I figured I'd take a look at that and see if it plays on any of the strengths better than the main game does, or if it falls into some of the same traps. Forges is mostly more of the same for better and worse. The level design certainly looks a lot more epic this time around, with huge flaming cathedrals reaching to the sky, or showing giant guns that could put a hole in Mars, or lava-filled forges, or is that forges filled with corruption? It all looks pretty decent when you get outdoors, but it mostly all plays the same. Minus a decent little platforming section with some harrowing, you just barely made it kind of jumps. Otherwise, you're still going from arena to arena, filling back up on supplies in small corridors that terminate in an elevator and takes you up to the next floor, punctuated by some platforming and light key hunting style exploration. It's dependable first-person shooter design, but more of the same. The real draws here are the 2 new weapons and the 3 or so major arena fights. Weirdly, the DLC chokes you on weapons for the first 30 to 45 minutes. I didn't get a shotgun for quite a while, and then all of a sudden you just pick up every game the main game had within about 30 minutes of each other, and then the real fun begins. But the real prizes, of course, are the 2 new weapons, the missile launcher and the multi-melta.
What are you talking about?
So let's talk about the multi-melta first, because it's less impressive, and it's also really hard to say without lisping, and I'd love to get that part of the script over with. So this is basically a souped up melta gun from the first game, except it fires out much broader, more highly damaging blasts that rip through enemies. It'll wreck fools, but it's also got this weird charge up delay before it'll fire, and it always wants to fire twice before stopping, which often wastes a shot you don't need, as the first one is usually enough to kill most enemies. Cool gun, but awkward to use sometimes when the fights are so frenetic that you don't have time to sit there and line up a shot and try to hold the button down just to get it right. But the missile launcher? Holy Hanna-Barbera, is this thing a crowd pleaser? And by crowd pleaser, I mean it pleases me when it one-shots a crowd like a fucking nuke going off. It is so satisfying to shoot, and it does great damage. It's not often I actually like missile launchers in games, as they're often weirdly balanced or clunky or low ammo, so you never can rely on them. But man, this one goes off and just looks fantastic. So yeah, the new guns are mostly good, and I'm glad they exist, but the unfortunate side effect of ballooning the weapon roster even further is that on console, the weapon wheel pops up 3 deep in all 4 directions, which is not only a pain to switch between, but clogs the screen up and lingers for too long. I also felt like I was constantly getting maybe 20 to 30 rounds off with one gun before it ran out and auto-switched to the bolt gun, which is far too underpowered for how relentless this DLC's high-tier enemy configurations are. So in short, the guns are running out of ammo so often that the weapon wheel is constantly having to be fiddled with, which clogs up the screen and makes it even harder not to take chip shots than it already was for our lumbering hand of the Emperor. And as for the major encounters, they're a bit hit or miss for me. The first one was that one I mentioned with the unclean one and his hordes, where I got the 2 bolt guns and then a missile launcher, but you run out of ammo so fast in all of these that you have to keep waiting for this little amount of ammo to keep respawning and keep cycling through and cheesing from afar, grabbing some more and then resuming the cheese. And I sat on this boss for like an hour, then realized that I could just run past him. Okay. The second big encounter is easily my favorite though. It's a multi-floor classic arena about verticality and different levels of elevation, with sloping walkways and tons of the big amble monsters coming out in droves. But it never trips you up with too much clutter on the ground, and there are plenty of little hideaways to take breathers in if you need to. The enemies stand out against the background well enough, and the business of assessing threats and being equipped by the arena to answer them is strong here. It also is just fun to feel like Noah's Ark just opened up and out came all manner of uglies great and small. It's an unusual configuration for this game, and it stands out all the more for it. But as forges wore on, I started to really loathe the big encounters. This one that takes place in a forge area isn't terrible, but the gimmick is having these lava pouring devices that are both cover and kind of a high risk, high reward shortcut to get through the arena to get away from bad guys. It's just a weird fight. Others are so frenetic that you really have to cheese them from afar, and then guys start spawning in behind you almost intentionally to take big chunks out of your contempt and health for doing so. So damned if you do, damned if you don't. Lovely. The last arena is eerily similar to the end boss of the main game, with multiple floors needing to be run through at breakneck speed to get away from the absolute hordes of high-level enemies. The trick here is that you've got to blow up a stationary object that's invulnerable for certain amounts of time, but even on medium difficulty, there just wasn't enough ammo to try and whittle down the bad guys and then focus on blowing up the object. And I couldn't split the difference and try and just hop around while shooting at the object and focusing solely on it, as there were lava pools all over the place just waiting to kill me if the enemies didn't. It was just such a deeply obnoxious encounter. I just turned God mode on to get past it and, get to the fun part again, only to find that this was the end of the DLC. So yeah, that was a bummer. Yet again, Boltgun felt like it had the basics down, but really starts to trail off for me anytime it ups the ante. Boltgun could feel simplistic for the right reasons up front, and then kind of wear out its welcome, and then when it tries to up the ante and break from this routine, it becomes too demanding for its own mechanics. Some enemy AI is dumb as bricks, and other enemy AI tracks you almost like a hit scanner. Some dogfights feel either too tipped in your favor or wildly overtuned against your lumbering strides and white boy jumping. Some levels are aces to get through because of subtle cues and interesting architecture, and others just make no attempt to guide you at all and just tell you straight up where to go. But when the game's just letting you gun your way through dudes or throw a chainsaw blade through someone's abdomen, it's a good time, if a fairly straightforward one. It's also fun to shit-talk your opponents, but I didn't really remember to very often because there's no real gameplay advantage. This and the melee combat I feel really should have been amped up a little bit, like where your shouts maybe intimidate or stun your enemies, or maybe you get some pickups when you opt to melee kill someone, like Doom Eternal's chainsaw or glory kills. The melee becomes a completely untenable option late game as you're open to damage from all sides while doing so, and the light melee kick, or whatever that accompanies it, are largely just window dressing and style points that make very little impact on your success in the end, which is too bad because the game's pretty much just about holding the trigger down otherwise. And that's really Boltgun's greatest strength and its weakness, its simplicity. It's the reason it's fun. It lets you get your hands dirty fast and frenetically. The damage feedback is fantastic, the gore is great, the sprites are sleek, and it's just a nice game to grind through when you want something that's not going to hurt your brain. But it did kind of wear out for me after a while, and the encounters started to run together. And when Auroch Digital starts mimicking some of the more subtle aspects of its shooter brethren like Doom Eternal's chess game, it often leans so hard into enemy complexity without properly equipping the player with the nuance to fight back. And when the game starts asking you to perform instead of play, it feels less and less enjoyable. Boltgun is simple fun when it works, but it can be a really frustrating bastard when it nobly tries to be more. That said, while I found the action drones on and just becomes the same thing over and over, for some, that will be just what they wanted. There is a good 7 to 10 hours of often mindless shooting to be had, the DLC is about 3 hours as well, and you'll get to use some of the most satisfying modern guns I've played with in recent memory, so I say, why not give it a try? To guts be the glory. Thanks for watching. And a huge shout out to those of you generous enough to support my work by subscribing to my Patreon. I have to thank Mark Neubauer, Deadforge, Hey Blondie, He Show, M, and Bibby F. and Blocksberg for their contributions. And a special thanks to the Nth Review and James Wyatt for subscribing to my Patreon's highest tier. If you'd like to be part of the reason this channel gets bigger and better, feel free to go over to patreon.com/high-functioning-medium, or you can become a YouTube channel member, or if you prefer, you can donate at Ko-fi. Also check out my GOG and NordVPN affiliate links to contribute to the channel with no cost to you. God bless you everyone, and I'll see you soon.